Hello, welcome. Welcome to Israeli Apartheid and the Climate Crisis. If you are here, we are going to just wait a moment for everyone to file into our Zoom room. Hello and welcome. We're giving everyone a moment to come on in. Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome. I am Anne Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am glad to welcome you to Israeli Apartheid and the Climate Crisis. Today is March 8th, 2022. Some housekeeping before we begin. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and me, ending around 1:30 Eastern. We are being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Hello to everyone joining us on Facebook. In addition to my own questions, I am eager to take audience questions. Please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can do so throughout the panel, and I will keep my eye on the Q&A box and do my very best to weave in as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. Please also keep an eye on the chat box. My colleagues will be posting resources and into the chat box throughout the webinar. Please do not use the chat box for your questions. I won't see them. Please note that we are enabling the closed captioning function so that you can read the discussion as well. Okay, to begin. As evidence of the current and future climate crisis continues to mount, today, we are looking at the dynamics of climate change for Palestinians. How do the realities of apartheid in Israel-Palestine, and in addition, Israel's siege and recurring bombardment of Gaza, affect Palestinians' access to clean water, sustainable land, consistent electricity, and food security? What bearing do these Israeli-imposed environmental limitations have on Palestinians' ability to stay on their land? And what does climate justice mean? And what could it look like for Palestinians? I am overjoyed to be joined today by three key activists and advocates. Khalil Abu Yahia, hi Khalil, is an academic writer and researcher in post-colonial literary and cultural studies. He is a Gaza-based English teacher at the Palestinian Ministry of Higher Education, and he recently co-authored an article published in 972 magazine called Gaza's Race Against the Climate Breakdown. Jessica Anderson is Deputy Director of Visualizing Impact, a team dedicated to creating data-led visual stories for social justice. Most recently, she initiated Visualizing Palestine's series on environmental justice. It is called Between a Rising Tide and Apartheid, and it was released in January 2022. And Manal Shqair is a climate activist, researcher, and the international advocacy officer of Stop the Wall campaign in Palestine. Please follow these panelists, follow their work. My colleagues are adding information on how to do that in the chat function, and we will also send that information out to everyone who registered for the webinar. So launching in round one, let's talk about apartheid. The Rome Statute of the ICC defines apartheid as, quote, inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. The UN also talks about the, and now I'm quoting, devastating consequences of climate change. Rising temperatures are fueling environmental degradation, natural disasters, weather extremes, food and water insecurity, economic disruption, conflict, and terrorism. Sea levels are rising, the Arctic is melting, coral reefs are dying, oceans are acidifying, and forests are burning. The UN calls climate change the defining crisis of our time. Today, we are looking at the intersection between the climate crisis and the crime of apartheid. So I want to start at the beginning. What is climate apartheid? Manal, will you start with us? Start for us, please. What do you mean when you say climate apartheid in the context of Israel and Palestine? Why is it important to use that term?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. To respond to your question, Sarah, in Palestine, climate apartheid is rooted in Israel's decades-long settler colonial policies and practices to obliterate Palestinian existence while imposing Jewish supremacy on our ancestral land. In other words, climate apartheid is a tool among too many other tools used by Israel in order to take over Palestinian land. And climate apartheid, it manifests in every aspect of Palestinians' lives. To talk about the West Bank in particular, where I live, climate apartheid manifests in the disproportionate distribution of natural resources, especially water, and this proportionate access to land. Currently, Israel controls more than 85% of the West Bank land, and more than 87% of our water resources in favor of the more than 500,000 Israeli illegal settlers who live on our stolen land. And in particular, in the Jordan Valley and the South Hebron Hills, which are classified as two of the most vulnerable areas to the climate crisis, Palestinians experience Israeli climate apartheid when they see Israeli water carriers that transfer water to the illegal settlements running through their communities while they are prohibiting from accessing water for their daily human use, for animal husbandry, and for agriculture. Palestinians in these areas are even like criminalized when they try to access their water resources. For instance, in 2020, the Palestinian community leader Abu Sakr and his son from the Bedouin community of Khirbat al-Hadidiyya, they were arrested, interrogated, and tortured for days by the Israeli occupation authorities because they were accused of stealing water, because they tried to access their own water resources. And another aspect, as I mentioned at the beginning, of Israeli climate apartheid is how it restricts Palestinians' access to their land, agricultural and grazing areas. In the Jordan Valley and the South Hebron Hills, Israel has been systematically limiting Palestinian shepherds' access to large swaths of grazing areas using different measures. I mean, in the past years, it used to shoot Palestinians' herds, confiscate them, arrest Palestinians, assaulting them. And now Israel is building more and more Israeli shepherd settler outposts in these areas in order to allocate all of the grazing lands to be used only by settlers who usually brutally assault Palestinians. So this threatens their food security because animal husbandry is a main source of income, and also it decimates their lifestyle. I mean, their pastoral lifestyle. And it creates a coercive environment where Palestinians are unable to adapt to the climate crisis effectively in order to displace them from their land at the end. And this is why I think it's really important to use the term climate apartheid in particular, because it highlights the interlocking structures of apartheid, settler colonialism, and the environmental degradation, and it also highlights the ecological aspect of Israeli settler colonial project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. So you said that so succinctly, the interlocking oppressions of environmental degradation, Israeli occupation, and settler colonialism. Thank you for all of that. Jessica, I want to ask you the same question. What do you mean when you say climate apartheid? Why is it important to use this term? And are there other framings here that you also think are relevant?
Thank you so much, Sarah Ann, and I want to thank everybody who's here and also Foundation for Middle East Peace for hosting us. And Manal, you said it so well when you got straight into settler colonialism as the root cause of all of this, and as well what you said about interlocking structures. I really love that. I want to add to that by saying, I think that it's worth noting that the term climate apartheid is sometimes used in conversations about climate change in a different way than how we use it within the Palestinian context. So I think that's important to note. And what I mean is that I've seen that sometimes human rights experts will use the term climate apartheid as a kind of alarm bell. So it's more of a warning that the climate crisis could lead to even deeper global inequality and even kind of wider gulfs between people that are able to adapt to climate change and people who are not, if we don't adopt a rights-based approach. And to give an example of that kind of use, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in 2019, it was Philip Alston, and he said, perversely, while people in poverty are responsible for just a fraction of global emissions, they bear the brunt of climate change and have the least capacity to protect themselves. We risk climate apartheid, or we risk a climate apartheid scenario where the wealthy pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. So in the context of Palestine, we're using the term a little bit differently because we're starting with the fact that Palestinians already live under a system of apartheid. And they live under this system in a part of the world that's warming faster than the global average. So that's kind of where what Manal said about these interlocking systems comes into play. So we're using the term apartheid to describe something very specific, a specific system of racial domination and oppression that in this context is controlling the distribution of both resources and risks between Israelis and Palestinians that are living in this very small geographical area, but are experiencing climate change very differently. So before we even get to climate change, before that phrase even enters the conversation, Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid as a tool of settler colonialism has made it so that Palestinians are experiencing food insecurity, water scarcity, housing shortages, poverty, landlessness, poor infrastructure, and de-development. And so you have to then consider the impacts of climate change as an added layer on top of all of that, or a threat multiplier, as we say. So in this region, the threat of climate change, we're talking about temperatures that are projected to rise higher than the global average, a decrease in rainfall, changing rainfall patterns, sea level rise, and more extreme weather events. And so at the intersection of these two crises, Israeli laws, policies, and practices really increase Palestinian climate vulnerability, as well as undermining adaptive capacity and denying, by denying self-determination, controlling land and resources, fragmenting Palestinians, dictating development, and dictating the movement of people and goods. And then as far as other framings that are useful, stop me if I'm going too long because it's hard to keep track of time, but I think that—
Continue. This has all been very helpful in your explanation of how climate apartheid is usually used versus how we're using it, how it's used with Palestine has been so helpful and so important. So please go on.
I'm glad. So I think other framings that are really useful, Manal got right to the heart of it when she spoke about settler colonialism and the denial of Palestinian self-determination, because that just points us directly to the root cause of climate apartheid. And when we're trying to have a climate justice conversation, I think what defines climate justice is looking for the root causes and trying to center communities that are most impacted. So I think that is really important. And then also Mazen Qumsiya and Mohammed Abu Sarhan of the Palestine Museum of Natural History in Bethlehem have a great article that I recommend that talks about environmental Nakba, which I think was a really interesting framing because it kind of captures how settler colonialism is ecological domination, that they are one and the same, they go hand in hand. One does not come without the other. And so the Nakba, we know that it violently disrupted the human geography of Palestine, but sometimes we don't think about how it also violently disrupted the Palestinian environment and the human relationships with the environment. So, and then my last thought is that in visualizing Palestine's recent series on environmental justice in Palestine, we tried to draw on a number of different concepts from the environmental justice scholarship and from environmental justice movements, and to illustrate those concepts with case studies from Palestine. So those were climate vulnerability, green colonialism, environmental racism, and colonial extraction, some of which I'll hopefully get a chance to speak about a little more later today. But those concepts, I think, were important because they really help position Palestine within this global conversation. And kind of within, Palestine is still often exceptionalized in progressive spaces, but this really helps us to have a discussion about environmental justice that includes Palestine.
Great, thank you so much. That was all extremely helpful. And I want to really strongly recommend that everyone watching and everyone listening go to Visualizing Palestine and look at the resources that you produced and that you mentioned. And we also will have the links posted on our website. So everyone will have access to them. And Khalil, thank you for your patience. I want to come to you, please. What do you mean by the term climate apartheid? And can you also tell us what is unique and special about Palestine? In your article, which I mentioned, published in 972, you wrote about Gaza as a, quote, climate hotspot within a hotspot. Tell us more, please.
Okay, first, thank you for hosting me. And actually, this makes the task harder since two of the most articulated activists talk about climate apartheid. I really adopt what you are talking about. It's great. And you hit the point. But let me, before I start, clarify that I'm from Gaza, which has been suffering from Israel's imposed siege. So one of the consequences of this appalling siege is the constant power outage and the internet as well. So if my voice is breaking out, please forgive me, and thanks to Israel Apartheid. I'm not responsible for that. Okay. Climate, to get to the point, climate apartheid for me is any act that manipulates and exploits climate suffering of a people in order to demonate, colonize, dehumanize, oppress, and deny the rights of that nation because of their color, race, ethnicity, or religion. But in our situation, Israel doesn't only manipulate climate change to further oppress the Palestinian people, but it also prevents them, the Palestinian people, from using their natural resources in combating climate change. So we are not only besieged, but we are also prevented from using anything, any use, any means to counter anything. Why do I think that it's important for us to call it apartheid, to call a spade a spade? Well, for me, and under international law, if we say that it is apartheid, this means apartheid is one of the greatest crimes against humanity under the international law. And if we say that what Israel is doing regarding the climate issue is apartheid, this means that Israel has to be held accountable, and that Israel is going against the international law. This will put Israel in the hot water, rather calling it just, occupation, which has like some outlets in the international law. Regarding Gaza, which you asked me about, the hotspot within a hotspot. Let me clarify that I am in favor of not differentiating between Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, 1948, because I think all of the components of the Palestinian people are suffering from the same multi-tiered system of oppression, institutionalized multi-tiered system of oppression in different forms. For example, in the West Bank, as my friend Manal said, confiscating land and other things. And in Jerusalem, their homes are being demolished and in Gaza, other forms. But I'll be specifically talking about Gaza since I'm from Gaza. Well, I consider that Gaza is the screenshot of the Nakba, and there is a misunderstanding in the world that the Nakba is something, and then we have intifadas and wars. No, Israeli settler colonial project started before the Nakba, and it has been operating and processing since now. It has never stopped. And Gaza is a clear evidence. Jerusalem is a clear evidence. The West Bank as well. Okay. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, we hear you.
Okay.
Please
Okay.
continue.
Okay. Just a second, because I want to change. Okay.
Now we see you also, but we hear you. Now we don't hear you, Khalil. I hope that you can return to us. As you said to us, the weak internet.
Sorry.
There you are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So Gaza has been suffering from this Israeli medieval hermetic appalling siege since more than 15 years. Israel has been doing that against the international law. When I think about that, I like to compare it to the South African, climate issues. When our South African comrades visited us in Gaza in 2006, I think 2007, they told us that what are you experiencing in Gaza compared to what we have been experiencing in apartheid South Africa? What we have been experiencing is a picnic. And the United Nations said that Gaza will be unlivable in 2020, and now we are in 2022. So what is special about Palestine and Gaza is that it's a hotspot. It is a hotspot in the world. Everyone is worried about that issue. And Gaza is not only worrying about climate change. It's not left alone with its natural resources to fight climate change, but it's also colonized. It is right. Everything inhumane against international law is being committed against the Palestinian people. And your conference and your event is important because, as Beatrice Spivak says, can the subaltern speak? And we cannot speak for ourselves, and we need to be given microphones to be here. So much for this event.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you for wanting to take the microphone when we were able to offer it to you. It is really an honor to be able to have you speak here today and join us, and honored also to have Manal and Jessica as well, and to be able to speak on this topic. And Khalil, your screen is going in and out, but we can hear you beautifully. And so I hope that you can hear us and stay with us. There you are again. And I want to stay with you actually for another moment and ask you specifically to speak on Gaza. I really appreciated that you just gave us the broader vision of Palestine in total. But I want to ask you to focus on Gaza. In your article, you described, and now I'm quoting your article back to you, ever worsening shortages of water and electricity, catastrophic flooding in dense urban areas, food insecurity exacerbated by drastic temperature increases, reduction in overall rainfall, the long-term impact of toxic chemicals. This is the bleak near future that awaits the Gaza Strip. And I want to ask you to talk to us about what is important in looking at Gaza specifically through a climate lens. What do we learn about apartheid when we look at Gaza through the climate lens? And so please tell us more about Gaza through this climate lens. And I'll add one last thing, which is that we've already, I want to bring in questions from the audience, and people are asking specifically, talk to us about the water situation, please.
Okay. So thank you for this important question. I want to say some facts before I go on. According to scientific researches, Sewage has infiltrated Gaza's aquifer and is flowing into the sea. 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human use and drinkable. Polluted water is a leading cause of the child mortality in Gaza. And Israel prevents Palestinians from using more than 20% of Gaza's arable land and target Palestinian water wells in Gaza. Let me remind you that the UN says that Gaza will be livable in 2020, and that was based on scientific, looking and scientific researches. What's important in Gaza here? I will be saying it's like from a practical point of view. My father is suffering from malignant cancer. My uncle passed away because of cancer, and two of my friends passed away because of cancer. And cancer was not caused by a coincidence. It was caused by Israel. Israel has been attacking Gaza since the beginning of since 2000. But particularly 2008, they attacked Gaza, killed thousands of people, destroyed wells and lands and trees. As if that was not enough, in 2012 they came back and they bombed us, attacked our wells, our trees. As if that was not enough, they came back in 2014 and the same in 2021, because they know that the world is sleeping and there is an international conspiracy of silence against the Palestinian people. I'm saying about governments, but thanks to the grassroots organizations that have been helping us. So we discovered, and again upon scientific researches, that Gaza has been bombing Gaza with poisons and chemical materials that cause problems in the land and in the water. So, for example, they are not pumping the water wells with traditional rockets, but with rockets with chemical materials, and this, infiltrates to other water, aquifers. And when we came after the wars and we wanted to water our trees, the water is poisoned, so the trees are poisoned, and the fruits are poisoned, and what we eat is poisoned with internationally forbidden weapons they are using. We in the war we went through experiences of smelling like bad things, poisons, and when we called the Red Crescent, they called us that Israel declared your area as a closed military area, so we cannot do anything to you. So it is like a slow motion genocide, as one of the Israeli, our friend comrades, called it, a slow motion genocide, killing the Palestinian people. Now the number of cancer patients rises from tens and then to hundreds and then to thousands of people who are suffering from malignant cancers because of eating, poisoned fruit and drinking poisoned water. And now Israel has made Gaza an open-air prison, which means that nobody is allowed to go outside Gaza, even to our lands, Jerusalem, for example, to get treatment. And moreover, they don't allow the medicine to come to Gaza, inside Gaza. For example, my father is suffering. They don't allow him to go there, and he might die any minute because of this, inhumane apartheid. This gives us an idea that climate apartheid, poisoning water, greenwashing Israeli crimes, and cancer and apartheid and incubation can never be separated. I hope that I gave you, I know that time is limited.
Thank you, Khalil. And I'm sorry for the loss of your family members and your friends, and I wish your father a full and speedy recovery. Manal, I want to turn to you, please. one fundamental aspect of occupation and apartheid is Israel's conquest of land. And I want to ask you to speak to us about how Israel affects Palestinians' relationships to land and to their land, and how that relates to environmental destruction and environmental crisis.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah. I think Khalil has just described how horrible the situation is when a healthy relationship between humans and the environment is cut, how this has catastrophic effects on both the human and the non-human. Jessica at the beginning also mentioned something really important about how before the world started talking about climate change, Israel started destroying our environment. And I here want to get back to before 1948. I mean, historically, for centuries, we managed to live sustainably with nature and with a non-human world. I mean, and personally speaking, I am a Fallahi. I'm a peasant woman from a village in the West Bank, and my family, which is a farming family, taught me that the relationship with a non-human is based on reciprocity and on interdependence. I was never taught to devalue the non-human world or to conceive it in dualistic terms. To conceive the non-human in dualistic terms in relation to the human. But all of that has totally changed in 1948 when Israel was created on the ruins of more than 500 Palestinian villages and towns, which resulted in the displacement of almost 1 million Palestinians who have been languishing in overcrowded refugee camps for more than 7 decades now. So after 1948, Israel uprooted too many of the trees that the native trees, usually most of the time they used to be fruitful trees that Palestinians used to depend on to sustain their life. And these trees were replaced by non-native pine trees that are unfruitful. So the relationship with the land has changed, or the purpose of the land has changed. The land, what was used to be like a source of food security for Palestinians, has become just like a green space, a recreational space. That is seen in the forests planted by the Jewish National Fund, mainly on the destroyed Palestinian villages. And at that time, it was challenging. What was most challenging for Israel is to try to decimate the pastoral lifestyle of Palestinian Bedouins, because they posed a real obstacle to Israel to territorially expand, because their lifestyle entails that they need to move regularly from one place to the other and be present in large swaths of the land. So what Israel did in 1950 was to ban the Palestinian black goat, which was necessary for that pastoral land-based lifestyle, because the Palestinian black goat is the native goat. It can cope with the harsh weather conditions and decline and reach to mountainous areas. So by law, Israel banned the black goat, justifying that it harms the environment. And now, in the absence of the black goat, which is necessary to clean undergrowth, and the fire-susceptible pine trees that are spread everywhere in present-day Israel, coinciding with the increase in temperatures, now the region is hit by more and more wildfires. In 2016, more than 1,500 fires spread across the country. And now Israel has recently announced that it will increase the number of the black goat, because they realized it's important in protecting the environment and in the sustainable relationship with nature. So that's about, I mean, just that a historical overview about how Israel has got the relationship between Palestinians and their environment, which was characterized by sustainability. And in the occupied territories in 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, Israel has been using too many different ways in order to cut the healthy relationship with the land. Some were mentioned by Khalil already. Others also in the West Bank that we see include the destruction, the systematic destruction of Palestinians' agricultural lands by this can be. It can be realized through dumping toxic waste into Palestinian agricultural lands by moving the most polluting industries from Israel to the West Bank, by closing Israeli quarries inside Israel while depending on Palestinian quarries for the stone industry and to keep it prosper. That's one thing. The other thing is, as I mentioned, Israel controls Palestinians' access or restricts Palestinians' access to their grazing areas in the South Hebron Hills and in the Jordan Valley. And this is also compounded with a decline in the rainfall and the increase in temperatures. So Palestinians may find it hard to graze their herds. So they end up overgrazing in that very limited spaces available to them. And this results in the desertification of large swaths of lands, of grazing lands, and this threatens the biodiversity in the Jordan Valley and in the South Hebron Hills. This is not to mention how Israeli settlements discharge wastewater into Palestinian agricultural lands. Also, last but not least, the construction of the apartheid wall, most of it inside the West Bank, in order to annex our land, has also resulted in detrimental environmental destruction, where Palestinians are unable to access their agricultural lands. And these agricultural lands have been neglected for years now. They've become wasteland. So that's another aspect of the environmental crisis that Israel is causing and is exacerbating. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. That was so helpful and so thorough. Thank you. And I want to look at it at a different angle of the environmental crisis, of the climate crisis. Jessica, will you talk to us, please, about food sovereignty and why food sovereignty is such an important principle of climate justice, and of course, what that looks like in Palestine?
Yes, I would love to. Actually, food sovereignty is a topic that we're working on for an upcoming visual, so I'm currently immersed in that. And I think building on what Manal has just been saying about the separation between Palestinians and their land, one of the kind of stats that I think represents that is the food insecurity figure, that 69% of Palestinians in Gaza and 33% of Palestinian households in the West Bank are food insecure, and there's a high reliance as well, especially in Gaza, on food aid. So just to kind of start by defining food sovereignty using the Via Campesina definition, food sovereignty is the right of all peoples to share healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about food sovereignty. And I think that it offers a really powerful and helpful set of principles and framework for thinking about alternatives to particularly industrial agriculture, which is a major driver of climate change as well as hunger and poverty. And so food sovereignty, along with agroecology, allows us to sort of center small-scale farmers who produce and feed a large majority of the world's people, and who are, hunting, fishing, gathering, producing food at the local level. And so that's kind of just to frame food sovereignty as a whole. But when we look at how Israeli policies deny Palestinian food sovereignty, at the high level, that has to do with everything that we've been talking about in terms of dispossession of land and forced displacement, particularly from rural areas. So kind of the forced urbanization of Palestinians. And as Manal was speaking extensively about the loss of the Falahi kind of history and traditions. Also, of course, the appropriation of water and the denial of freedom of movement and control over imports and exports. So those are some of the big things that we're looking at when we look at how Israel restricts Palestinian food sovereignty. Both Manal and Khalil have given quite a few examples of specific restrictions, and I'll just kind of fill a few gaps of things that I noted down that they haven't mentioned already. With the Black Goat Act, I wanted to add to what Manal said by just noting that in the 1970s, Israel established a Green Patrol, which was a paramilitary unit that went around and seized and slaughtered flocks. And so I think that kind of just illustrates the militaristic approach to, even if you believe that the black goat did pose an environmental hazard, there's different ways of responding to that. And this was a very militarized, very violent approach that reflects the attitude toward the Palestinians who were the people that possessed and herded the black goats. There's also the issue of criminalization of edible plants. So again, I think these examples, it's important to note that they affect all Palestinians. It doesn't matter what fragment of the territory you live in, what citizenship or identity status you hold, everyone is subject to restrictions on food sovereignty. So, Palestinian citizens of Israel today, there's still a ban on the collection of edible plants like za'atar, akub, and sage. That also applies to the West Bank. There's been court cases against Palestinians, and if you're interested in that, I recommend the work of Rabia Aghbariya. He's written a lot about the court cases and the issue of criminalization of edible plants. One thing I came across that I found interesting was the quota system that is used by the Israeli Ministry of Agriculture. So they uphold a quota system, and Palestinian farmers who hold Israeli citizenship were completely excluded from that system until very recently, 2012, which is, to me, it's just very striking that that's the case. And then in 2012, they were allocated 0.02% of the milk quota and 0.03% of the egg quota. So there's market, factors going on here. There's also been in the West Bank military orders that have required Palestinians to obtain permits to plant certain crops. And Manal spoke about the issues of farmland that falls into the so-called seam zone of the wall. I'll just add to that by saying that Palestinian farmers who continue to try and farm that land have to get a permit to access it, and Israel denied 73% of those permit requests in 2020. With the water issue, something that a fact that I found interesting is just because of Israel's control over water resources and the development of water infrastructure, a large majority of land cultivated by Israeli settlers is irrigated crops, whereas Palestinians, only about 6% of their land is irrigated. So you see that Israeli settlers are practicing certain intensive forms of agriculture that Palestinians, even if they wanted to, simply can't because of the water restrictions. And then in Gaza, there's the issue of, with the blockade and the siege, the effect on fishers and people who make their living from fishing. In 2019 to 2020, there were 133 shooting attacks by the Israeli Navy on fishermen, which wounded and killed Palestinian fishers and damaged boats and equipment. And then the spraying of herbicides over the Gaza Strip is another issue that Israel does that to clear the vegetation, to create a kind of clear buffer zone, but those herbicides also drift and they damage thousands of dunams of crops. And a forensic architecture has done some really interesting work to visualize the flow of those herbicides on the wind. And then the market controls, again, imports and exports. Gaza can't export a lot of the produce that it does produce. It can't reach the Israeli market, let alone the international market, and has limited ability to reach even the West Bank market. So lots of issues with food sovereignty there. And I think, just to wrap up, when we think about what Palestine looks like in a world where there is food sovereignty, it's some of the principles of food sovereignty. I mean, land rights is at the heart of it. So land rights is a pillar of climate action in multiple different contexts where Indigenous people are being pushed off of their land. So it's not just Palestine. And that means, of course, decolonization, which is a big one. It's not, there's no easy fixes here, but also bringing self-determination into the equation. Palestinians really need the ability to control their own agricultural policy, to control their own resources, and to set their own trade policy. And that would be crucial for a world where, Palestinians can sustain themselves and have food sovereignty, and where they no longer rely on food aid, which really kind of perpetuates food insecurity. It offers temporary relief, but it can't change the underlying systems that lead to food insecurity. And then finally, I think preserving agricultural heritage is really important, because part of Palestine is a part of the Fertile Crescent, and it's a region that has a very long history of agricultural production and innovation. So Palestinians have practiced rain-fed agriculture. They have traditions of foraging. They hold actually a lot of essential heirloom seed varieties that are considered globally valuable for preserving agrobiodiversity. So also, I think when we think about food sovereignty, we have to think about protecting Palestinian agricultural heritage.
Fantastic, Jessica, thank you. Thank you for that very thorough and detailed answer. Also, I want to thank you all for the thoroughness and the detail with which you are addressing these questions around the climate crisis and climate vulnerability and degradation and oppression. And I actually want us you've been talking in such detail, and I want to ask you to take a step back for a moment, and let's talk about frameworks. Let's talk about how we think about climate apartheid a little bit. You have all spoken about settler colonialism or decolonization. Khalil brought in Gayatri Spivak, which for anyone who has read post-colonial theory, I hope got the reference, and it is International Women's Day. So thank you for bringing in a feminist scholar, Khalil. I want you to talk to us about colonialism. I want you to tell us, please, what you mean when you talk about colonialism in the context of Palestine, and to what extent does colonialism shape or impact the climate crisis?
Okay, thank you for this very significant question. Actually, colonialism in its traditional definition is the domination of one nation over other nation, taking advantage of their color, ethnicity, religious, affiliation, and so on and so forth. But in the Palestinian context, we have a settler colonialism, which is the replacement of one nation, and in the case of Palestine, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, and the bring of another nation in order to occupy the land which has been, occupied before them by another people because of race, ethnicity, religious, and so on and so forth. What makes climate crisis different in Palestine is that we, the Palestinian people, are not only fighting and combating climate crisis and the climate change, but we are also combating the last settler colonial regime and system in the area. We are fighting the fourth strongest army in the world, while in the military equation we have nothing compared to Israel. The Palestinians have been fighting with rockets and nothing compared to Israel. In this In this equation, the Palestinians are being suppressed, oppressed, and dehumanized, regardless of the international law and the nations of the world calling for the justice of the Palestinian people. Colonialism, in this sense, prevents the Palestinian people from furthering their efforts to fight, the climate change. And Israel, through its policies, has been, making sure that the Palestinians are not able to fight anything. For example, in the wars, they are particularly attacking the Palestinian infrastructure. Everything that's related to electricity. The only power plant in Gaza has been attacked. Hundreds, if not thousands, of dunams have been, bulldozed in Gaza by the Israel occupation forces, creating high rates, unemployment rates in the Palestinian community, especially that the Israeli authorities know that most of the Palestinian people depend mostly on farming as their main source of income, and creating a vulnerable Palestinian community through their colonial policies. So what is important here is that if we want to decolonize these practices, we have also to decolonize, climate change. There is no separation between, fighting climate change and, fighting injustice and occupation, because they are inseparable. You cannot, decolonize the Palestinian land while our natural resources are colonized. I cannot call myself in a free Palestine while I cannot drink a drinkable water, a healthy, clear water. So what is also important here, that the climate issue in the frame of the Palestinian colonized land is not only the responsibility of the Palestinian people, and when we are fighting colonialism and apartheid, climate apartheid in Palestine, it's not only for the Palestinian people, but it's rather about all the humans in the world, because we are, at the end of the day, we are humans and we are fighting in the same thing. And I cannot imagine myself fighting to prevent injustice in Palestine and allowing climate apartheid to happen in Ukraine or in any other place in the world.
Thank you so much, Khalil. Jessica, I want to move to you with the same question about colonialism, and to your new climate resource, Between a Rising Tide and Apartheid, draws on colonialism as a frame. You talk about green colonialism and colonial extraction. I want you to talk to us, please, about what those concepts mean in the context of Palestine, and also you talk about greenwashing, and we brought in that term a little bit. I think Khalil mentioned it a little while ago, and we need to hear more. So please.
Thanks, Sarah Ann. So yeah, so these visuals, we were exploring, different dimensions of colonialism, different kind of typologies of colonialism. And with the term green colonialism, it's not separate from settler colonialism or from any other type of colonialism. It's just a way of describing a certain colonial phenomenon. So I heard the term green colonialism for the first time actually in the context of reading about another indigenous community, the Sami people of Northern Scandinavia. And in that context, they use the term green colonialism to talk about a struggle against the corporate wind energy projects in that region that exacerbate existing colonial losses. And I found it to be such an insightful analytical lens for understanding how projects that claim to mitigate climate change challenges are impacting people that are already, experiencing harm in the existing systems. So in our green colonial visual, we defined, we use the term green colonialism to describe a broad variety of policies and practices and programs, both governmental and by organizations, that end up harming the land and rights of indigenous people in the name of environmental protection or climate mitigation. So really just reinforcing the colonial legacies. And specifically, the case study we used for that looked at Israeli parks and forests and recreation sites. So there are 182 depopulated Palestinian villages that are located in Israeli parks, forests, and recreation sites. And what Manal was speaking about earlier with the planting of pine trees, a lot of these sites are planted over, essentially. So there's a phenomenon of erasure going on, both in terms of the ecology of these sites and also the narratives and the fact that by being declared a nature area, Palestinians can't return to those sites. So we wanted to emphasize both that history, but also that this is it's not just a historical issue, it's an ongoing issue, the sort of ongoing environmental Nakba, to go back to that idea that Israel continues to use environmental policy as a tool of settler colonialism, which we saw very clearly earlier this year with the images that were coming out of the Naqab and the protests there against the JNF forestation project that was pushing Palestinian Bedouins off their land. So we see that these initiatives have the power to displace people. They also have the power to kind of delineate spatial segregation to create more segregated environments, which we see a lot in East Jerusalem with the way that parks are established to kind of connect settlements or to cut the territorial kind of unity of different Palestinian neighborhoods. And also by declaring a park, it's a very easy way to restrict development. So in the West Bank, large areas of land have been declared nature reserves, and that means that Palestinians cannot, pursue development in those areas. So there's also there's other issues that you can talk about when it comes to green colonialism. So going back, the wind story that I mentioned is where I first encountered this term actually shows up in Palestine and Israel as well, particularly here in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, where there's a wind project going in by a company called Energix, and there's a lot of coercion happening around how land is being allocated from Syrian farmers who've already lost so much of their land to Israeli colonization. And now that's being kind of pulled into this drive to create wind energy. So corporations are really important to consider when we think about green colonialism and when we think about conservation, because corporations, as we know, never fail to take advantage of a crisis to consolidate their power and to find a way to make a profit. So this kind of, I think, also helps us to be more wary of the false solutions that are sometimes put forward to climate change that end up just putting more power in the hands of people in groups that have already caused harm. So for green colonialism, it doesn't matter whether the harm is intentional or unintentional. It just matters that it's perpetuated, that colonial harm is perpetuated. But when we talk about greenwashing, the other term that you mentioned and that comes up in that visual, we are talking about something more deliberate and kind of cynical, which is, the use of environmental projects as a cover, basically. And in the context of Israel, the Israeli government and Zionist organizations portraying themselves as environmentally friendly when at the same time they're responsible for committing human rights abuses against Palestinians, which come with environmental devastation, as we've been discussing. So the JNF is kind of the most prominent example of this. It presents itself as an environmental charity, but it upholds a discriminatory mandate. It's a quasi-state organization, and it's actively participating in ethnic cleansing. So then, final note, we also have another visual that focuses on colonial extraction through a case study of Israeli quarrying in the West Bank. And so that's kind of introducing another sort of typology of colonialism into the conversation, because colonial extraction is kind of what you think of as classic colonialism or exploitative colonialism, where a government is a colonial entity is going and its main purpose is to extract raw material or labor from the colonized territory and bring it back to its own state. So we see that this kind of phenomenon exists in this context as well, and that different types of colonialism can coexist hand in hand, that there's features of different sorts of typologies that we see. And with the issue of quarrying in particular, it's just a very familiar story where you have resources that are being taken from one community for the benefit of another community, and it leaves behind both a legacy of de-development in the colonized territory and wealth consolidation in the colonizing territory. So, and again, here multinational corporations are involved. Look into Heidelberg Cement if you're interested in how they're involved in quarrying and how they're paying the Israeli government and Israeli settlements for the right to quarry Palestinian stone. So a lot to look into there, but I'll pause here for now.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. That was a lot, and that was extremely helpful. And I want to ask Manal to dig in deeper in one specific direction that Jessica went. Jessica mentioned the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And Manal, talk to us, please, about the role of the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, in greenwashing Israeli environmental degradation.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, Jessica has already mentioned really important facts about the JNF and how it's a trailblazer in Israeli greenwashing. The JNF calls itself Israel's largest green organization, and oldest green organization in the world, by being proud of its afforestation projects that were planted to cover up destroyed Palestinian villages, as Jessica mentioned. And these trees that the JNF planted stood as soldiers to prevent Palestinian refugees from returning back to their lands. I mean, the refugees who were expelled from their land in the mass ethnic cleansing campaign held by the Zionist gangs between 1947 and 1949. Also, the JNF planted these non-native pine trees in order to realize the Zionist eco-imagination of Palestine as a European colony in the Middle East, to make the landscape more familiar to these Jewish immigrants who mainly came from Europe, in addition to many different purposes to plant these trees, including greenwashing the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And as Jessica said, the JNF continues to commit more crimes against Palestinians, and continues to entrench Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism, because this is the sole aim for which the JNF was created in 1901. For instance, the JNF, in addition to its attempts to ethnically cleanse the 100,000 Palestinians living in the unrecognized villages in Naqab through planting trees, the JNF also supports the illegal settlement enterprise in the West Bank, be it directly through claiming the ownership of Palestinian property and land in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem, and in other parts of the West Bank, or indirectly by supporting Israeli settler organizations that build and expand illegal settlements. Some of these settler organizations also support settlers, fanatic settlers, like the group that is called the Hilltop Youth, which leads violent campaigns against Palestinian farmers and against Palestinian villagers. And the JNF supports settler organizations that particularly build and support ecological settlements in the West Bank, or agricultural settlements, which is another form of a green colonialism. And another thing about the JNF is that it takes part in perpetuating the refugee situation of millions of Palestinians, because the Jewish National Fund owns approximately 13% or a bit more than 13% of the land in Israel, and the rest is owned by the Israeli Land Authority, on whose board the JNF has 10 out of 22 seats. So the JNF controlled, either directly or indirectly, the land that belongs to millions of Palestinian refugees who are denied their right to return. And the JNF has been committing all of these crimes against us while wearing the garb of environmentalism. It's unfortunately recognized as a partner organization at the COP to the UN Convention to combat desertification. And it participates in UN conferences on climate change, where it participates in discussions regarding solutions to the climate crisis. And in this way, the JNF takes a major role in, or plays a major role, in projecting an image, or an environmentally friendly image of Israel. Also, it promotes Israel, an image of Israel as a water power through what is called the Blueprint campaign, which focuses on developing water infrastructure in Nakab, not necessarily to find, of course, not to find solutions to the water crisis, which is mainly man-made in Palestine, by the way, because of Israeli apartheid, but in order to attract more and more settlers to live in Nakab on Palestinian-owned land. And in addition to this, I think that the JNF has been successful in convincing the world, or in having power in different countries in order to be registered as a charity, where it collects money in about 50 countries around the world in order to support the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So the JNF, more than any other example that exists, is the perfect example of how green colonialism and greenwashing just intertwine in order to advance Israeli settler colonialism and to solidify its apartheid system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. And thank you also for speaking about the Nakab, the Negev, where anyone who's been watching has seen Bedouin protesting and being arrested by the dozens. I'm not actually sure how many at this moment have already been arrested, but there have been so many protests, and we've also seen lots of Bedouin women leading them, and women and children being arrested in this struggle against forced JNF takeover of their land. So thank you for that deeper dive into the JNF. And I want us to cover one more aspect of environmental crisis before we're going to shift our view to talking about justice and talking about mobilization and resilience. And the next piece that I just want us to talk about is, Jessica, I'm going to ask you to talk about a little bit about Israel's military investments in global militarism, and the relationship between militarism and climate change, please. And I'm going to ask you, to try to be a little bit condensed. Thank you.
Yes, I'll try and keep it high level, and start by mentioning that I think we're all very familiar with the ways in which Israeli militarism harms Palestinians and the Palestinian environment. We've talked a lot about that already, and I think just to highlight one point from that, one thing that's important to look at always is infrastructure. Khalil has talked about the impact of the repetitive bombardments on Gaza on infrastructure, and how that's harmed water, and how that's harmed electricity that's essential for processing sewage waste. So always to look, when we're looking at conflict, when we're looking at war and militarism, the impact on infrastructure is huge. The impact on the environmental harm that's caused by the kinds of chemicals that are left behind by bombings, the contamination of soil and water. Those are all issues that we see everywhere that war takes place. And globally, it's quite recognized that militarism is a leading contributor to climate change. So if you look at the US military, it has a larger carbon footprint than about half of the countries in the world. So if you were to list all the countries in the world by climate footprint, the US military would be about halfway up the list. And then when you look at Israel, its per capita military expenditures are actually higher than the US's per capita military expenditures. And its spending on the military as a percentage of its overall budget is also higher. It also consistently ranks in the top 10 countries in the world for weapons exports. So Israel, this is not new information, but it is heavily invested in militarism. So we have to have that discussion about Israel's role globally in militarism. And I think there are particularly, I think it's relevant to look at this in terms of what's happening now around the militarization and securitization of the world's borders, because one of the projected impacts of the climate crisis is the displacement of people. We're seeing that at the scale of Palestine, but globally, the World Bank has projected that climate change could displace 180 million people from the global south by 2050. And we've seen that, countries with a colonial history, after destabilizing a lot of the world, are then responding to that precariousness by making themselves into fortresses. And Israel is, they're hoarding resources and then they're making sure nobody else can get in. And Israel is a global leader in controlling the movement of people. It has developed these systems and really honed them in the context of apartheid. And now it's exporting surveillance systems and border control systems to the EU and to the US. We see Israeli technologies on the US-Mexico border. We see them patrolling the EU Mediterranean, where migrants are left to drown in the sea. So this is a really bleak picture of the future of a climate apartheid future where millions of people are on the move and countries are responding by just trying to lock down their borders. So definitely, Israel is prominent in that conversation, and divesting from militarism has to be a major focus of climate justice movements.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for returning the focus of a question on militarism, focusing not just on weapons and their destruction and on munitions, but also on the actual people and what happens with people. And that migration is so much a part of militarism, forced migration, involuntary migration. So thank you for that. And I want to shift us. We have about 15 minutes left. We're going to talk about justice, and we're going to talk about social movements and resilience. And so, Khalil, let's start with you. What is climate justice in Palestine? What is climate justice? What is climate justice for Palestine? Please.
Okay. So climate justice is quite the opposite of climate apartheid, which I consider the enabling the oppressed to protect themselves from climate vulnerability, to stop preventing them from accessing their natural resources, and quite to help them even to further their process of climate, breakdown. But the problem in Palestine is that justice here is given for an ethno-religious group, which is quite an anachronistic and a 19th century idea, differentiating between people based on their ethno-religious identity. And we have the few years ago, the nation-state law that was passed by Israeli authorities that perpetuates Israel's supremacy and clearly says that Israel is for Jewish people only. And note that Israel doesn't have a constitution. Instead, it has a set of basic laws that have constitutional status. Climate change here in Palestine is politicized to serve the interest of the colonial power. and to further the oppression of the Palestinian people. So clearly and simply, we cannot undo this oppression unless we politicize the struggle for climate justice. And history teaches us that the colonial powers make benefit from every possible way to colonize the people. So if the oppressed people, want to counter and to resist this, including climate resistance, is to undo and to reverse the colonial means, to use them in favor of the oppressed people. Israel has been repeating the slogan, making the desert bloom. Come on, guys. Can you make the desert bloom while committing crimes against not only the people, the Palestinian people, but also the environment? I want to tell Israel that it's not the fault of the environment because it is not Jewish. Environment is environment. Environment is nature. You cannot make the desert bloom while you are committing war crimes, and while you are saying that you are a green state. You are not a green state. And let me give you that information that Israel has been planting trees, green trees, in order to hide the villages from which the Palestinian people were ethnically cleansed back in 1948. Okay, they say that you are not able to resist, climate vulnerability because of your leadership. You did, and you voted for them. I don't want to go for that, but it's like when we say that we have to punish the American people because they voted for Trump or they voted for Biden. This is anachronistic and this is not fair. What I'm saying is that apartheid is not green, and justice for all people is green. The Zionists and the Israeli authorities say that, okay, we want peace. Okay, we also want peace, but we want peace with justice. We want our natural resources to be used by both, we and you. What we, the natives, are offering is a one climate for all, regardless of religion, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So we are offering a secular democratic state for all people, climate for all people. And Hayo Meyer, who is a Holocaust survivor, and I like his quote, said that you cannot bring a house, you cannot bring a mouse and put it in a room with a lion and then close the room. You have to bring an elephant in support of the mouse. And the elephant here is the grassroots organization, is the momentum, is the individuals, the people who are making events like this. This is very important, event and a very important activity in calling a spade, in putting, dots on the letters, and in supporting not only because the Palestinian justice, but also the justice for the Israeli people, because we think and we believe that the task for the Palestinian people is not only to decolonize the Palestinians, but also to decolonize the Israelis. And we have, joined the struggle. We are not against any Israel or any Jews. We love them, and we have, partnerships. We want, as I said, one climate for all, regardless of anything.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you for that, for being so clear about that. I want to turn to you, Manal. What do you mean by climate justice? And will you talk to us about how Palestinians resist Israeli climate apartheid?
Yeah, sure. I agree with Khalil's definition of climate justice, and add that it's to be able to adapt to the climate crisis when we have sovereignty over our land and natural resources, and when our full menu of rights is recognized, and that the moment of when we realize climate justice is the moment when we dismantle Israel's settler, colonial, and apartheid structure and fulfill our right to self-determination. That's the core of a climate justice. And talking about our resistance to climate apartheid and to Israel's larger project of settler colonialism, we've never stopped struggling against that. And our struggle and resistance is seen in too many different ways. One way, among others, is through the everyday practices of sumud, which translates to to steadfastness. It's the persistence of Palestinian communities in the Jordan Valley, in the South Hebron Hills, in Naqab and other parts of Palestine, to try to navigate, to never leave their land or never accept to be detached from their land, while navigating different ways through which they try to adapt to the climate crisis, using the minimum means they have. Recently, I co-wrote a research paper focusing on the role of Palestinian women in the South Hebron Hills within their domestic sphere in tackling the Israeli environmental destruction and settler colonial practices. And I found out that they use really creative and important ways in order to maintain a connection to the land. For example, they preserve an indigenous or a pre-colonial way of agriculture that mainly depends on rain-fed agriculture. They depend on natural fertilization of the land. And they also try to find creative ways through which they harvest water to be used throughout the dry months and the dry season, especially in the summer. That's one way. Another way is to resist Israeli climate apartheid is the fact that the Palestinian civil society is becoming more and more dependent on solar energy as a response to Israel's denial Israel's denial of access to electricity. I mean, again, that these apartheid practices that are implemented against Palestinians in Area C. Also, tree planting is another way in order to respond to Israeli climate apartheid. Every year we plant thousands of trees in different parts of Palestine, and tree planting is for us like an environmental and a political tool of resistance, and it also strengthens the connection between Palestinians and their land. And it is, metaphorically speaking, it is a tangible image of the steadfast Palestinian who refuse to be detached from their land. Last but not least, we resist Israeli climate apartheid in order to realize climate justice through regular protest in different parts of Palestine against Israeli illegal settlement expansion and against the plunder of our natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. And we're going to come back to you in a couple of minutes, short minutes, and end with you asking you about what it looks like to engage with this work internationally. But we'll come back to that. I want to actually shift to you right now, Jessica, and ask you about how you think that understanding climate apartheid in Palestine should or does affect movements working for solutions to the climate crisis overall, and how might climate justice activists in Palestine organize with other movements, both to end apartheid in Palestine and also to fight for climate justice across the world?
Thanks, and thanks again, everybody, for being part of the conversation today. It's been really insightful, and I've loved listening to my co-panelists and all of your comments. So I think this is a broad question that really, it deserves its own entire panel, and so I'll keep my answer a bit broad. I think that ultimately, for me, understanding climate apartheid in Palestine has kind of guided me toward more, I think, a more radical and transformative relationship with communities that are on the front lines of climate crisis. And that's what I would hope that other environmental groups, other climate and environmental activists can also gain by understanding the situation in Palestine, just the recognition that of the importance of looking toward the root causes of the climate crisis and toward positioning ourselves in solidarity with those who are most impacted. And why? Because those are the communities that are already so deeply invested in resisting the systems that are, that are destroying both human rights and the environment. So I think that in that sense, I think this is a transformative conversation for the movement, and there's a lot of movement education left to be done, in my opinion. I also think that this conversation challenges the depoliticization that sometimes happens around climate change. And on that, I would point you toward the recent article by Muna Dajani in Al Shabaka. She talks about depoliticization and normalization in the context of climate justice in Palestine, and speaks to it much better than I could. But once we recognize that climate change is a political issue and that it does require political solutions, I think that we can engage in more meaningful organizing. And I saw that there was a question in the chat about the EcoPeace initiative. I personally am not very familiar with that initiative, so I can't answer that question, but I will say that Muna Dajani does mention that initiative in that piece. So maybe that's a starting point. But I also think, this conversation sort of points us in the direction of looking out for false solutions. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of techno-solutionism in the climate movement, especially coming from governments and corporations, which is just this idea that, like, if we just invest in enough research and if we just have the right technology, we're going to find like this magic bullet, so to speak, that's going to get us out of this pinch that we found ourselves in. And I think, I'm not rejecting the role of technology in addressing the climate crisis by any means, but what I'm saying is that sometimes that comes at the expense of looking at the political dimensions of this issue. And sometimes it's also, favoring, again, the kind of corporate actors and that are looking to consolidate their power through this crisis. And, so we need to be wary, I think, of those kinds of solutions. And then, also just this whole conversation brings out so many shared experiences between communities that are, subject to colonialism and militarism. And of course, those experiences are not identical, they're unique, but there are overlaps that I think help us build power and come together around things that serve, the interests of communities on the front lines. And then in the US context, particularly, just to get a little, more concrete as I wrap up, I think I would love to see different communities coming together from the environmental movement around ending military funding to Israel. And I also think, Palestinians can have a lot to add in terms of the conversation around bringing a more global and decolonial perspective to things like the Green New Deal, where it's kind of missing currently, and challenging the way that the US military right now is kind of trying to reposition itself as an asset in the climate struggle, which I think we need to reject and say, we're not, the path through this is not further investment in militarism. It's the kind of invest, divest framework that's emerging from so many different social justice movements. Thanks, Sarah Ann, for the conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for all of that. We are in our last questions, the last questions for Khalil, the last question for Manal, and then sadly, we will have to end, though this conversation is absolutely wonderful. And like Jessica said, I think we could do a whole conversation just focused on this question of climate justice and organizing for climate justice and what it looks like. And Jessica just referred to Muna Dajani's article, how Palestine's climate apartheid is being depoliticized. It's a very powerful article. I recommend it to everyone. We have posted the link on our website and in the chat. And Khalil, I actually want to turn to you to talk to us a little bit about what the struggle for climate justice in Gaza and in Palestine more broadly can and should look like, and also what your thoughts are on this question. What does it mean for the climate struggle to be depoliticized, and what do you suggest, recommend, push for to counter that depoliticization?
Okay, since we are suffering from a multi-tiered system of oppression, it's impossible to separate between different forms of oppression. We cannot end occupation and colonization of the land while our natural resources are still colonized, as I said before. So the struggle against colonialism, racism, militarization, and our struggle for climate justice, economic justice, social justice is interwoven, interconnected. Palestinians, like any people in the world, just seek for their climate justice by different ways guaranteed under the international law. If we, regarding your question, if we depoliticized our struggle, so it's not struggle, it's not any further struggle of the Palestinian people. Take out apartheid. There is no climate apartheid, and there is no justification for fighting Israel or fighting Israel apartheid. I would definitely love to live in this state if it is not built upon and by and from and through apartheid. So if we take this political flavor, so this is a message that the Palestinian people are fighting for nothing. Politics is the root of climate apartheid in Palestine, and if we want to uproot climate apartheid in Palestine, we have to uproot this from a political point of view.
Wonderful. Khalil, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Manal, I want you to take us home, finish. You get the last word, please. And I actually have a two-part question for you. How can environmental justice groups and people in the US and across the world support Palestinians' struggle for climate justice? And can you just tell us how the work on climate justice is interwoven with the broader work on ending apartheid and the broader work on decolonization?
Sure. Thank you a lot, Sarah. Yeah, to address the first part of your question about what role can environmental groups can play, I think it's important and central to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. I mean, the climate justice groups across the world and people across the world and governments must hold Israel accountable and end Israel's impunity by imposing targeted sanctions on Israeli apartheid, by also supporting Palestinian calls on the UN to investigate apartheid Israel and impose a military embargo on Israel. I also think it's significant to support campaigns led by the BDS call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions that challenge or resist Israeli greenwashing, like the campaign against Israel's national water company, Mikrot, and Netafim. I also think that climate justice groups internationally can play a role in delegitimizing the JNF in different environmental spaces and challenging its greenwashing actions and efforts. Also, climate justice groups can support Palestinian-led initiatives in order to revoke the charitable status of the JNF by being a grassroots force that pressure their governments in order to never allow the charitable law in different countries to be used for or exploited for ethnic cleansing, as what the JNF is doing. Another aspect of support to our struggle for climate justice, especially in the US, is to support the Defund Racism campaign, which is a Palestinian-led movement that's trying to stop Israeli settler organizations that are registered as charities in the US from exploiting the US charitable law. That's really an important and a key campaign in order to stop money from flowing into Palestine to ethnically cleanse us and to build illegal settlements. And also, it's important for the U.S. citizens to tell their U.S. members of Congress to support the defunding the human rights of Palestinian children and families under Israeli Military Occupation Act, which is Act HR 2590, in order to hold Israel accountable and its impunity. The other part of the question, which is how our struggle for climate justice is interwoven with decolonization, I think. Yeah, I think Jessica and Khalil answered it. I just want to end by emphasizing that because Israel to environmental degradation and to disrupting the relationship between Palestinians and their land, I do think that it's important to support our anti-colonial struggle in order to stop further environmental degradation. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion.
Manal, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Manal. Thank you, Khalil. This was a really, really powerful discussion. It was extraordinary to get to hear all of you and hear you bring your expertise and your passion, all of you. So thank you so much. I need to say one caveat, which is that the Foundation for Middle East Peace is not a lobbying organization. We do not lobby for legislation. We are happy to provide a platform for people who are campaigning and for activists, obviously, but I just need to state for the record that we are not a lobbying organization and don't promote legislation. I am so grateful to you all for joining us today. So grateful that we got to have this conversation. And I want to thank everyone who joined us or listened to this event. We are really glad that we got to share this conversation with you, with all of our listeners. We tried to weave in the questions that you put into the Q&A box. So thank you very much. And we will share all of the questions that you asked with our panelists so that they can know what you, the audience, wants to hear. Please, everyone, check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a list of resources relating to the conversation that we just had, for announcements of upcoming events, for our webinars and podcasts. Thank you all so much for joining us. See you next time. Thanks so much.